both organized the Global Ecologies Conference and this evening's keynote. While we were going through that long introduction, and my mind was going back to the 70s, to the days of Chipko, I was also thinking of all the women's actions taking place right now at home. And that's a price I pay for, I call myself the little bee or the little butterfly, to maintain cross-pollination between cultures and people at a time where capital would like to be globalized and have us all live like little frogs in a well, believing every narrative that's given to us. So there's a march that started today from Mumbai to Delhi, a women's march, against land grab. Because that corridor from Mumbai to Delhi, they've identified as an industrial corridor for freight trains and moving stuff, and so it's supposed to be the Japanese investing, but Japan is collapsing financially. So I can't figure out how, when Japan cannot rescue itself, it's going to find all that money. But the way that money is found is through subsidies from nature and people's resources. And the coast of India, the eastern coast in Orissa, one of the world's biggest steel plants is being planned. The name is POSCO, which is a Korean steel plant name. But in the 1997 disaster, the financial disaster, you remember when the dragons disappeared and the tigers disappeared? POSCO was privatized. And 2 years ago, when the anti-POSCO movement wanted me to organize a conference in Delhi, we did some research and found out it's actually owned by Wall Street. Huge shares by Citibank, and Mr. Buffett owns 5%. And we were doing this exactly at the time when he was traveling through India with Bill Gates. They called it the art of giving. So I wrote an open letter to say, Mr. Buffett, it would be helpful if before you talk and preach the art of giving, you could learn to stop bragging. And of course, Bill Gates is the ultimate philanthropist or philanthro-oligopolist, or what would you call it? I can't figure him out, but he is singularly financing the destruction of agriculture. Started with AGRA, the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, 30 years after all the lessons of the Green Revolution in India had shown that this is neither sustainable nor just. But this is all part of a certain way of thinking and then living in the world based on the idea of man's empire over the earth. And of course, Boyle went on to say that the sacredness with which indigenous communities here, the Native Americans, hold nature and the veneration they have for the earth is an impediment in establishing man's empire over lesser creatures. And of course, the lesser creatures was all of non-human life, but a large part of the human community. It was all the indigenous cultures. They were just defined into the fauna and flora of the land. It was the women. It was the slaves. Because the idea of nature being dead matter and mere raw material that is born from an empire in the mind creates real empires on the ground. And those real empires are based on the concept of terra navia, stay empty earth. There's nothing out there till we occupy. So to say of Native Americans, they don't cultivate. They have the richest food cultures. The three sisters growing your corn and your bean and your squashes together, thousands of years that cultivation has lasted, but they don't cultivate. Only because there has been an interesting confusion and an illusion that destruction is creation, that violence is creative, and creativity is passive. And whether it is the violence against women or it's the violence against the earth, it's based on that confusion. And sophisticated instruments have been evolved, both in the reductionist science, the mechanistic science, but also in the dominant economic model. How is growth more measured? First of all, why did we create something called growth? I've just done a promotion for a book called GDP, Gross Domestic Product, the world's most powerful number. And one would imagine gross domestic product would measure what growth goes on in the household. And given that so much of women's work is maintaining, renewing the household, and all of the Earth's work is maintaining, renewing the planet as a home, as oikos. One would imagine that this GDP, gross domestic product, would be measuring what the Earth provides, the work women do, their creativity. But the definition is, if you produce what you consume, you don't produce. Now sadly, every step of nature's renewal is based on nature consuming what she produces. The water cycle, you consume what you produce. The nutrient cycle, you consume what you produce. Self-reliant economies, sustenance economies, you consume what you produce. But that one single definition says you don't produce. So you don't get counted. Women don't work. And there's a very powerful book by a fellow ecofeminist. Where did my water disappear? The back. Marilyn Waring, I'm sure some of you have read her book, If Women Counted. And Marilyn was the youngest MP of New Zealand. And every time she'd ask for money for childcare or women's welfare, she'd be told there's no money. And then someone would say, we need this many more missiles. And the money was there. You know, what is it? How come money becomes available for things we don't need, the violence, the wars, and it's never available for things we really need? One level, you're going through this with your cutbacks, and they call it sickness shit. I've just got a message, they've cut back a lot of ecological farming support in this. But no cutback on the agribusiness subsidies. And I don't know when the budgets for the wars and violence will be cut. But she said, I'm going to follow this through. And so she went all the way to understand how growth was going. And it was a category of measuring growth as GDP was created during the war to mobilize resources for the war. And so all the production had to be reduced to nothingness. Just like in the takeover of empire building, the land had to be declared empty. And by and large, most cultures have related to the earth and her resources as a commons, whether it be the water, or the biodiversity, or the seed, And definitely in indigenous cultures, the land too. I mean, in India we have a saying, Sabi Bhumi Gopalki. You don't own the land, you use it, but you don't own it. Therefore it's not tradable. You can only farm the amount you can farm. And the minute you stop farming, it goes back to the community. You can't have absentee landlords in that culture of usufructuary rights as different from tradable property rights. And the very creation of property is based on a definition of mixing human labor with nature, but not the labor of that which you own as property, which included the horses and the bullocks and the women, because they were shackled, and the slaves. Now, I find it fascinating that Locke was writing on property at a time when the enclosures of the commons were taking place in England. But there's not one sentence on the enclosures of the commons. It's all contextualized in North America, because here the new occupation was taking place. If you define that as property for Europe, it would have been recognized as the enclosure of the commons. Here, it was defined into creation of something new, rather than a grabbing of resources. And as time has passed with this paradigm of man's empire over the earth, larger and larger spheres of sovereignty and subjecthood have disappeared. Beginning with the earth family and all species as an extended family. In India we refer to Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the family of the earth. Chief Seattle talked about the web of life and humans being a strand in it. That was reduced to humans, but not all humans. The anthropocentric paradigm was also an ethnocentric, was also sexist and patriarchal, was also denying people from other cultures their subject. People became objects just as much as the earth became object and property. And today, through the neoliberal paradigm, which goes in the name of free trade, globalization, you can choose, that exclusive subjecthood of the property-owning white male has got distilled into this new fiction of a corporation not just as having a legal personhood, but being the first citizen, globally and in every one of our countries. So when the WTO was being, when the GATT, the European round of GATT was being finalized, which led to the World Trade Organization, the Director General of the WTO at that time said, "This is the world's constitution." But I've kept track of that negotiation, the institution, and every treaty was written by a corporation for themselves. It was a corporate constitution imposed on the world. I know that the Intellectual Property Treaty, Monsanto has admitted they wrote it. And as they say, we did something unprecedented in human history. We wrote a treaty, we defined a problem, and the problem they defined was farmers save seed. That was the problem. And we offered a solution that now onwards it should be an intellectual property crime to save seeds. But they went further and said we were the patient, diagnostician, and physician all in one. We took the treaty to the government of the US, which took it to the GATT, and then it was imposed on the world. Cargill is a little more quiet. They don't go around showing off like Monsanto. But Cargill wrote the agriculture agreement. The vice president of Cargill became the negotiator for the US government for agriculture. And the agriculture treaty doesn't have a word on soil or farmer or food. It has 3 sections: export, competition, market access, domestic supply. It's all about market grab. And I could tell you story on story on what this has done to Indian agriculture. Before all this happened, I used to write essays like this will be the death knell of Indian farmers. That's what I thought. And it has become. Of course, the corporation is not new, and its early birth, 1600, you get the first corporation, East India Company. Why was East India Company formed? And why were the corporations of that time formed? Because before that, you had merchant adventurers going out to grab the silver, the gold, the land. Maybe the silver and gold would come back. But it wasn't just one country. Of course, the first setting out was by Columbus under the Papal Bull, 1492, which said, go find lands not ruled by white Christian princes and own them on our behalf. And Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand were supposed to have got the instructions straight from the Pope, and the Pope, of course, had the instructions straight from divine. That's called the divine right of kings. And when I started to work on the issue of intellectual property rights and patents, and I wanted to understand, where did this word patent come from? It comes from that piece of parchment that was given to Columbus to set sail and conquer others' lands and take over. It is called a letter patent. Patent meant open, the open letter, to open it and declare to whoever that this land is now ours. Because everything else was a closed letter with a seal, because it was all about wars in Europe. You wouldn't tell the world I'm going to invade you tomorrow. It was all secretly done. So the letter's patent was about conquest and takeover of territory and land. And in a way, today's patents on life continue that tradition. I call this in my book, Biopiracy, the second coming of Columbus. And just like takeover of territory and land was based on the idea of the empty earth, terra nullius, everything that is happening today with seeds and plants and agriculture is based on an extension of that notion, and I call it bio-nullius. Life is empty. There's nothing out there. So the intellectual property rights agreement starts imposing patents on civil life. And that's when I started Vandana in 1987, when I realized that this is what the corporations were doing. For me, it's absolutely unacceptable to define other life, which has intrinsic worth, intrinsic value, self-organization, self-creation, as the invention of a corporation. Just a patent is an exclusive right given to an inventor, which prevents that inventor, which allows that inventor to prevent anyone else from making, using, selling, distributing what is patented. Seed is not invented. A seed is millions of years of evolution, thousands of years of breeding, collective memory, different cultures. And even more importantly, and this is what my studies in quantum theory have taught me, that nothing is fixed. You think this pen is this hard object. No, everything is in the unfolding of its potential. The world is about potential. And the seed's potential to continue that biological and cultural evolution is limitless. And that's why the word seed in Sanskrit and Hindi is bija, that from which life arises on its own again and again and again. And it's self-organized life. An acorn will become an oak tree. A tiny mustard seed will give you a mustard plant. You don't have to keep giving it instruction. You don't have to tell the acorn to become coconut. But the entire idea of both genetic engineering as well as industrial farming is plants don't know what to do with themselves. You've got to give direction from outside. And they now are using a phrase called directed evolution. So of course, one consequence of this is the companies that had no idea about the biological diversity of the planet were busy over a century making poisons for war. Then the same poisons were moved into agriculture as agricultural chemicals. They also along the way became the pharmaceutical industry, so you get cancer from their toxics and then they give you the medicine. They suddenly turned to life and remodeled themselves as the life sciences industry. You don't. You can pretend to invent life. But the first thing you do is steal. Just like land was taken in the first colonization. What's basically happening now is an epidemic of biopiracy, where indigenous knowledge and cultures, which have worked with biodiversity, and all of this knowledge is women's knowledge. All of patenting is based on either theft from nature or theft from our grandmothers, who knew that the neem is a good pest control agent. 84, I joined the movement after the Bhopal disaster. And my little contribution was to take neem trees. And I remember when I was catching the train, the coolie was laughing and said, "Why are you taking these saplings? They grow all over our village." I said, "Because there's this pesticide plant that has leaked and killed so many thousands of people. And here's a beautiful tree that can give us non-violent pest control." So we started a campaign, "No more Bhopals, plant a neem." 10 years later, I find it's been patented. 11 years before that case. And one of the things I learned to do over these 40 years of activism is, how do you fight giants with no money? So we had no money to fight the neem case, but I had to go to the European Patent Office. We tried to the US Patent Office, and they asked us, "What's your commercial interest?" We said, "We have none. We have a public interest." So, "Oh, that doesn't count." You have to be competing commercial interests to even admit a challenge. But Europe has a clause on ethical considerations, so we were able to file under that. And there were two other women who joined me. One was the head of the Greens, the president of European Greens, and the other was the president of the International Federation of Organic Agriculture Movements. And together we filed. I brought all the data. I brought the 100,000 signatures. And they would make the trips every time a hearing took place. We won, they appealed, and finally we won against their appeal too. And it was a beautiful moment because, you don't know how these benches go. So the judges had said, after lunch we give a decision. We go off to the European Patent Office, cafeteria, and come back, expecting maybe they're going to allow the patent to continue. And they gave a one-line decision. First they said, "Congratulations on Women's Day." It was an 8th of March. They said, "The patent has been permanently struck down." That was the first legal victory against biopiracy. We've had to do it all again and again and again. The basmati from Dehradun, patented by a Texas company, or rice tech. That's the other thing about this illusion of creation. You put tech against anything, and you're the creator. So, our dals have been destroyed, and 3 years ago, when the food prices started to climb, and our pulse and dal prices started to climb, suddenly there was, in the ration shops, this thing called Aida. And my sister picked it up. And then we ran. It It was basically soya flour, dyed yellow and turned into a pus. And I think they just put I because they think I means iPhone, iPad, iPad, tech, creation, invention. So many people in the West have gluten allergies because of the way wheat has been bred for the industrial processing, and therefore has very high levels of gluten. Because breeding today is not for what it should be. It is not for biodiversity. It is not for the quality of food. It is not for evolutionary flexibility and adaptation. Breeding has only two purposes: uniformity, adaptation to chemical inputs, and worse, adaptation to long-distance trade. So when you're going to throw things into long-distance trade, how do you want them to look and feel? A delicate banana? India has the biggest production of bananas. We are nowhere on the global scene. Because, you pluck your bananas and eat them. But when they're to be shipped, they've got arctic skins. But to treat them with chemicals first, to ripen them artificially, and then to keep them, pretend fresh. And of course, the first genetically engineered product that they ever did was something called a flavor saver tomato. I think it was a company called Kanji, which was later bought up by Monsanto. This flavor saver tomato had basically had its genes for ripening changed. So it was a rotten tomato, but it looked fresh. And I call it the Botox tomato. Like a 65-year-old woman who wants to look like a 30-year-old. But paralyzing her skin. Can you imagine? You consider a paralysis as a beauty treatment? Of course, the whole idea of all of this is somehow to extract rents from life. The habit of life is to reproduce. So can you imagine how just by turning seed into patented property, you have a permanent rent collection system. It's called royalties. In India, when Monsanto entered, and like I said, they show off, so they put advertisements in the newspaper, so I can catch them. And I can deal with our government and our courts, etc. Otherwise, how would we even know? So they come in with this BT, cotton, which is a toxic gene put into the cotton. And now it's their property. And they lock every Indian company into a licensing arrangement so the Indian companies can't sell anything else. They persuade the farmers, get rid of your old seed, it's primitive. They call it seed replacement. And they managed to somehow have research institutions that used to put out 20, 30 varieties of cotton every year to suddenly not do anything. You know? I'm sure you've noticed it in this country, how government agencies suddenly become incompetent. So, in the period from 97, 98 to today, since Monsanto took over the cotton seed supply, and now the price has jumped 8,000%, control of Monsanto is 95% on cotton seed. Farmers have got into debt, unpayable debt of a kind they can't understand. Because private debt is a consumer debt. Every other debt in the past was a producer debt. For the first time, an individual farmer is getting locked into this promise that you'll be a millionaire. 270,000 farmers have committed suicide. And if you make a map, most of them are in the cotton area. One of the things I said to Amy this morning was, this is a women's issue. Because seed was a women's issue. Women were the seed experts. There's not a culture I know where women were not the seed experts and the seed keepers. And seed didn't fail. Because of everything that went into the care of the seed. When I named the movement Vandana, I was really taught by a tribal peasant about the cosmic meaning of it. But then I started to notice everywhere. On the New Year's of Karnataka, that part of India in southern India, they have, the New Year festival is called Ugadi. The women will plant 9 seeds. And they watch over 9 days. How's it doing? If the chickpea didn't do well, they borrow from a neighbor. If the barley was very good, they share it with their neighbors. So at every point, every ceremony, every ritual is a seed breeding and a seed testing. I have seen in the tribal areas, which are the source of the diversity of rice, 200,000 varieties. I've been to their festivals of planting. The women will take away seeds, 21 exactly. Put it into the soil before sowing. If one seed doesn't germinate, they will increase the seed rate. 2 doesn't, they still increase it. Up to 3, they do a proportionate increase, knowing that this one won't. But if 4 don't germinate, they go and take from someone else who has better quality seed. So at every level there's a safeguard. No question of a seed failure. And no question of a debt, because it's yours, your seed sovereign. But in the calculus of growth and GDP, it doesn't count. We have continued to both monitor the harm that is being caused by Monsanto's monopolies in India, but also follow what's happening elsewhere. In '98, while Monsanto was introducing the GM cotton in India, they were going after a farmer in Canada called Percy Spicer, whose canola crop had been contaminated. And Monsanto said, "You have stolen our genes, you pay us $200,000. And Percy turned around and said, "Well, if your genes are in my crop, you've polluted my crop." But he lost in the lower courts, went up all the way to Supreme Court. We intervened from around the world. And the fine was struck down, but the judges said, if we start to patent genes, this is an inevitable consequence. And you have a very, very important case in front of your Supreme Court. It's called Bauman versus Monsanto. Now, Bauman didn't buy Monsanto's seeds. He bought seeds from an elevator and then threw them out. Monsanto is saying, any plant grown out of a grain, no matter how many generations down, is ours. And sadly, the judges seem to be agreeing. Because once you accept intellectual property rights, it's the consequence. So what has Monsanto basically done? It's taken a plant which has 46,000 genes, put one toxic gene for Roundup resistance, and says, I created the plant. It's like me coming in with this glass into UCLA. See, I brought this glass. You could have all the buildings, everything, but I built these buildings. I'm the architect, I'm the landlord. UCLA pay me a rent. And I could have a brilliant source of funding Vandana forever. But UCLA will throw me out. You consider me insane. We have allowed the insanity to rule over how we relate to life. And every institution is working to serve that insanity. That's why I'm so deeply committed for both the liberation of the seed and the liberation of the farmer, and the liberation of people to have food freedom. Our campaign on seed freedom, I hope you'll all join. You can go to seedfreedom.in and also the Vandana website, MAVDANYA. One of the judges, I think it's Justice Butler, when the case was brought to Supreme Court, he said, no, you have to protect intellectual property rights because this is the reason. This only incentive for making inputs. And a similar decision was given in the European Court of Justice about how there's a superior objective being met by the biotech industry. Is a Roundup Ready seed improved? Is the addition of a toxic gene an improvement in the measure of evolution, in the measure of human welfare, in the measure of the web of life? No. It's a scrambling of the tree of life. And it's not doing too well either. The narrative is solution to hunger. Failure to heal. There isn't an increase in it. Big announcements, this is going to get rid of chemicals. Increase in chemical use. And then there are only two applications, herbicide resistance and pest resistance. Both have given us super pests and super weeds. Half of America's farms are now overtaken with super weeds that can't be controlled with Roundup. So if you have contamination, the normal principle that applies is the polluter should pay. When you have intellectual property rights, polluter should pay becomes inverted, polluter gets paid by spreading contamination. And Monsanto lawyers have said as much in courts. To say contamination is the way we are going to spread control over seed, contaminate. There's another case I'm part of called Oscata, 80 groups. Filed a case in the New York courts to say genetic engineering is contaminating organic crops and it's ruining our organic production and our organic seed. So please stop Monsanto from not just contaminating but suing us after they contaminate. Yeah. And you know what the judge said? You don't have standing to organic farmers. The case is up for appeal. And when you in California wanted something simple that any democratic society should have, the right to know what you're eating. If you are what you eat, then surely this is the most fundamental right to know. And the industry panicked, $40 million spent, you know the story. All of this is connected. Proposition 37 and patents are very intimately. Because the reason GMOs have to be pushed, and the reason you can't know that you're eating GMOs, is because that is where the royalty connection comes from. And if you just look at how our diverse agricultural systems have been replaced by ever-increasing monocultures of four crops: corn, soya, canola, cotton. It's the royalty that explains it. There's a case going on right now. Brazilian farmers have sued Monsanto $2.2 billion because of this unreasonable royalty connection. These cases are all over. You can find out much more about them in the fact report that's on our website on seed freedom. The arrogance that when you have no idea what you're doing, when you make a GM, you have no idea what you're doing, you shoot blindly into cells in a petri dish with a gene gun. Not all the cells will absorb the new gene. So you add an antibiotic resistance marker. You add a viral promoter. The introduction itself requires all kinds of bacteria and viruses. They have no idea what all this does. At all. And yet they say it's safe. And I've called it ontological schizophrenia because when you claim ownership, I made something totally new, never existed in nature, I'm the inventor, I'm the creator. You say, okay, whatever this new thing is of yours, what does it do to the web of life? What does it do to biodiversity? What does it do to human health? No, just like nature did it. It's substantially equivalent. And this is the structure of man's empire over the earth. Appropriation as creator. And for all the ecological impact. A wonderful presentation at the Global Ecology Conference on our living in an age of fallout. That is not mine, it's yours. Indian farmers, why did you commit suicide? Because you're too stupid to understand. You're too stupid to not have irrigation. And the climate is stupid because one year it rains and one year it doesn't. So everything is wrong, but I'm perfect. The tools, the master's tools, can't go wrong. And this arrogance of treating destruction as creation and treating the scrambling of life on Earth as managing it is what has led to the emergence of the latest version of man's empire of the earth. The arrogance of calling our times the Anthropocene age. All that we have in this time is a footprint of the carelessness of the fossil fuel-based, chemical-based, globalized economic and production and consumption system. It's not a management system. And in any case, every age is the age of Gaia. Every age is an ecocene. The hubris that we are creating again now goes through genetic engineering, the idea of engineering, and we've got all the failures of the Green Revolution. He puts in, now I'll fix it, to perfection. But now I'm working with the genes, this is exact. Now you're working with genes without knowing what you're doing with the genes. You don't even know what living systems are about because the science has overtaken. With epigenetics, agroecology, all the new knowledge is about relationship. The old knowledge is about reductionist, billion thoughts. And earlier there was also the reference to the eugenics movement. But if you look at the roots of genetic engineering and molecular biology, very, very good history of science book by Lily Kay called The Molecular Vision of Life comes out of the eugenics movement. These theories don't just happen. They're shaped with deliberate engineering of the mind. So you have geoengineering. We create artificial volcanoes. I've debated some of these fellows. They say, okay, you create artificial volcanoes to create enough pollution so the sun doesn't come, and then global cooling for 5 years. And what happens to photosynthesis and food production in that period? That's not my department. That's what messing up with the earth isn't your department either. The latest, most extreme genetic engineering is what's called synthetic biology. And this is very, I mean, if you want to see the personification of patriarchal power and arrogance, look and listen and read Craig Venter. He's controlling the entire science and technology, money and research money of this country. They miraculously say they're going to solve every problem. You know, I'm holding this cup in my hand and it's made from plants. It says 0 carbon footprint. But the point is, if the entire infrastructure we have built, if all the consumption we have shaped with easy access to fossil fuels, and if that has to be reproduced by using biomass, which is what the synthetic biology thing is about, there isn't enough land. So you've got to do the terra nullius all over again. And that's what the land grab around the world is about. Besides the minerals and all the other things, but the biomass grab for biofuel is linked very much to synthetic biology. And the new pretend at solving the problems. This is what one of these bioeconomy, green, there are many words that are coming up for it. A prerequisite for the bioenergy potential in all regions is that the present inefficient and low-intensive agriculture systems are replaced by 2050 by the best practice agricultural management. And the interesting thing is when they describe inefficient, what are they measuring as efficiency? Not the resource input, not the energy input, only the labor input. I get fascinated by the fact that all of agricultural productivity only measures how few people work in the food system. I remember once a report of FAO, I was at this meeting, and they had the bubble of food growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And if you look at the axis, it's labor rate. So automatically, the fewer people there are on the land, the more the energy slaves are working your farms, you have higher agricultural productivity. So we live in the illusion of more, while we create less because we're using 10 units of input to produce 1 unit of output, whereas in ecological systems, you can have 1 unit of input to produce 2, 3, 4 units of output. And in any case, if you look at soya, that Monsanto says is now their property, 2% of soya is being used as human food in this country. The rest is all animal feed and biofuel. It is not a food system anymore. It's a commodity production system. And commodities are not distinguished in terms of what they're used for. Wherever there's money, and there's bigger money in biofuel subsidies right now. There's also more money in the pockets of those who own cows than the poor who are hungry. 80% of all food eaten in the world today is coming from small farms and gardens. 80%. And yet that is what is called inefficient. On a 2% land in Nigeria, women produce 50% of the food with home gardens and other efficient ways of using the land. And this issue of low intensive is probably the most abusive word, because I've worked on the Green Revolution and this thing called intensification. And the illusion is if you intensify, somehow miraculously you're using less land to produce more food. But you're not intensifying land use. You're extensifying land use. What you're intensifying is chemicals, capital, and fossil fuels. Chemical intensification means more toxics, more environmental problems, more cancers. Capital intensification means more debt, more mortgages, more foreclosures, more suicides. Fossil fuel intensification is what has led to industrial farming being 40% of the climate problem. At Vandana, we work on biodiversity intensification. We work on ecological intensification with no external input. We work on the intensification of care. And per acre, we produce more food and more nutrition and more health than the industrial chemical system. So the narrative that we must depend on industrial, agriculture, GMOs, synthetic biology, is again part of that illusion of creation. Part of the illusion of overcoming scarcity, when in fact it is manufacturing scarcity, beginning with the seed. Yesterday in the radio show with Rishi and Carter, we talked about the seed. How one seed can give rise to 1 million when it's the millet seed. But every seed gives rise to 100,000 million. That is abundance. And you never run out because the seed carries the future. When it's genetically modified, patented, made non-renewable, you begin with scarcity. And so you have a very serious seed famine across the world. And that's another reason for us to have started our seed freedom campaign. Because in this arrogance of saying we control the world, they're not even able to deliver. So we are within, I think we're already in a very serious food crisis. I mean, if 1 billion people aren't getting to eat, and 2 billion are seriously ill because of the food they're eating, that's a major food crisis. And if nothing is done, and we don't change track, we are going to be able to starve half of humanity. But the seed issue is where it all begins. And the seed is where solutions come. Another very common word we use these days is knowledge society. You know, every invitation I get, they all either want to talk innovation or knowledge society. And the fascinating thing is, we are an ignorant society. We've got no idea anymore how we're messing up the world. And because we've deregulated commerce, commerce and commercial activity. We don't have to. When I was looking at those slides, and looking at how everything intensified for women's rights after the 75, but the same period, our environmental protection also intensified. We're really talking only about 30 years. And yet that 30 years is being dismantled by the day everywhere. Everywhere. It's not deep, it's not robust, but even that thin protection is seen as a mega threat. We will have to move out of this anthropocentric myopia of naming our time the Anthropocene to recognizing that every age has been an age of the earth. It has been the age of Gaia. And the best we can do is live as Earth citizens, with humility, with a sense of deep awareness of our relation with all other life on the planet, and the responsibility that comes with it. A sense of Earth community. I think for economy, we have to become aware that economy is only sustainable and just if it functions like a fully owned subsidiary of ecology and ecosystems. And at least every day at home, I'm reminded how human rights are not oppositional to Earth rights, but are derived, the rights of the earth. And human wrongs go hand in hand with the wrongs against the earth. We have a legacy of fragmentation, separation. I call it eco-apartheid, the separation from our knowledge of being a part of the earth. Because we can't be separate. In fact, the culture that says we have liberated ourselves from nature is the culture that is most predatory on nature, with its very heavy footprint. So we can never be independent of nature, but we can co-create with nature. We can be deeply aware of the abundance she can give, and our needs that she can meet. And our liberation and the liberation of the earth is so inseparable and so indivisible. And that is why in Vandana we work through Earth democracy, which is the democracy of all life and a living democracy for human communities. Because we have witnessed our economies becoming genocidal and ecocidal. Our democracies either dead or dangerous because they have mutated so rapidly from being of the people, by the people, for the people, into being of the corporations, by the corporations, for the corporations. And all this can only be upheld through a culture of insecurity, fear, and an anxiety about diversity. We have to create living economies, we have to create living democracy, we have to create living countries. And for this larger democratic and deeper democratic urge, we focus in Vandana on 5 simple freedoms. Freedom of the seed, which is also our freedom. The freedom of the land, which is also our freedom. The freedom of food, which is also our freedom. The freedom of rivers. I've just done a declaration of freedom for the Ganges, from the Ganges, the instruction she's giving us. And the freedom of biodiversity in our forests. Bolivia has done something amazing. Ecuador has done something amazing by actually legally, constitutionally starting to put the rights of Mother Earth into their constitution. At this point, those are the civilizational leaders for moving into an age where human beings once again can make peace